All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob Winograd. Welcome back to the LCI Green Room. I already said Jacob Winograd. I'm the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast here at the Libertarian Christian Institute, part of our Christians for Liberty network. And I'm excited to be with you guys tonight, taking a little bit of break from the nonstop content I've been doing on Scott Horton's book, which I'll just plug again, by the way. We're doing a book club slash book discussion series here at the Libertarian Christian Institute on Scott's new book, Provoked, which, as you see right there. So if you haven't seen those, go check it out. We've already done a couple sections, talked about the end of the Cold War, talked about up through the Clinton administration and shock therapy into the Bush administration and the rise of Putin. So diving into history, seeing the sort of like beginnings of modern day conflicts, as well as learning lessons about economics, which will come into when I relates to the guest I'm going to be talking to here in a little bit. Before I bring him up, I also just wanted to remind you guys, first of all, like this video, those of you who are watching live. That way more people can see it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And then I want to remind you guys that the Libertarian Christian Institute, we are a nonprofit, and so we do operate off of donations from viewers like you. And I'll remind you of our end of the year fundraiser. We're trying to fulfill a challenge grant we were given. So every dollar you give, up to $15,000 is matched. That's our goal, to try to fund our projects going into next year and expand what we're doing here. So if you enjoy our content, you enjoy the articles, the podcasts, you want to see us attend more events, do more panels, we greatly appreciate your support, as well as sharing those links out if you would be so happy as to do so, which if you want that link, it's real simple. It's right there at the bottom, libertarianchristians.com/donate. Well, tonight's guest, I feel like doesn't need too much introduction. I think everyone knows who he is. Been on our show here before, the Libertarian Christian Institute. Bob Murphy, a fellow at the Mises Institute, Austrian economist, and host of the Human Action podcast, as well as the Bob Murphy Show. I'm going to bring him up right now. Bob, how you doing tonight?
Doing great, Jacob. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm I cannot wait until next week and I get to like pause for
Okay.
just a little
Did you
bit.
throw your back out lifting Scott's book up for the camera?
Yeah, I think I sprained my wrist, so I might have to get a splint for that later on. Yeah, no, it's a masterpiece of history. But I have your book right up there, by the
I
way.
see it.
People can see that. Choice. I read Chaos Theory, but I don't have that on hand at all. But yeah, for those who don't know Bob, I mean, Bob is my go-to guy when it comes to economics, as well as when people have questions about like, because I lead with the punchline with the name of my podcast, right? Biblical Anarchy, and that's intentional to get people going, what the heck are you talking about? And I'm like, well, I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff at you, and and at the end of the day, you agree with it, but you don't like the word, then throw the word out. But just the idea of private law, the idea of subjective value theory, and it can sound a little like, when people first hear this stuff, they look at you like you're speaking a different language, but this stuff's important. And I'm excited to talk about things related, because last time you were on, you and I talked a little bit about economics, but we were also talking more about other controversies going on between Dave Smith, Andrew Wilson, and sort of like
Oh yeah, right.
the divisions between paleoconservatism and paleo-libertarianism. Today we're going to be diving, I mean, this still touches on some controversies, which we'll get into, but we're going to be diving more into the nitty-gritty of the economic side of it. And before we dive into, I guess, like the reason that we ended up talking tonight, because we're going to be talking a lot about the Federal Reserve and talking about monetary policy and all that. And I don't want to just assume from the get-go that everyone listening is an expert at that, because my audience is kind of split between libertarians such as you and I and just Christians and conservatives who might know this stuff a little bit, but it's not always easy to find information on this, or if they're hearing for the first time, they might want a little bit of a summary. So I thought we could start out by giving you an opportunity to give us a concise, good enough summary breakdown of how, what the Austrian school of economics criticism is of of central banking and fiat currency, inflationary money printing, and the boom bust cycles and all that. And then that'll kind of set the stage for everything else we're talking about.
Okay, sure. So I'll err on the side of being concise, and then if you want me to dwell on something further for your audience, just you be the leader on that. So one thing I want to make clear up front is it's a common misconception, and some Austrian professors feed into this just in the interest of trying to simplify it into elevator pitch, but it's actually not the case that the Austrians think, oh, the central bank causes the boom bust cycle. Okay, and partly I stress that because if you lead with that, then the critic can say, well, there were depressions with a small d before the Federal Reserve existed in U.S. history, so checkmate. And then you don't want to be on your heels and go, well, really the thing is so that's why I stress up front. So more specifically, then what directly is the theory of the business cycle that was first really developed by Ludwig von Mises and then elaborated upon by Friedrich Hayek, is the baseline here. The Austrians tend to be very sympathetic to the free market, and in particular private property and prices quoted in the money, and that's why they like money to be sound, that it's not being debased because it serves a vital function. The prices, there's different ways of saying it, communicate information. It helps entrepreneurs calculate, right? So in the Misesian view, why is it that capitalism works whereas socialism is doomed to be a horrible economic system? It's because there's no way in a socialist system for the central planners to get any feedback, even ex post, to know, are we using society's scarce resources in an efficient manner? They just have no way of knowing that. All you would really see is a huge, combination of inputs, this many tons of steel and this much, crude oil and this many worker hours of various types of skills and blah, 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 and farmland. And we have this many cars shooting out and bushels of wheat and so on. And then to say, should we tweak the plan? It would be really hard beyond obvious things like, there has to be enough food so everyone doesn't starve to death, but beyond certain things like that, it's not clear how do you even know how to tweak the plan, right? So Mises, in a market economy, it's the prices, in particular the profit and loss system, that gives that feedback. Loosely speaking, if a business enterprise is profitable, what does that mean? The money the consumers spend on their goods and services that they make as output has a higher market price or value than the inputs they used up making the stuff. So that business enterprise is using the resources that it's siphoning out of the system effectively, at least as far as the consumers are concerned. All right. So given all that now, what role do interest rates play in all this, framework? And the Austrians think, well, those in particular help coordinate activity over time. That there's a sense in which, the interest rate, there's different ways of thinking, but like the 5-year interest rate is kind of showing what's a present dollar's value versus a dollar not available until 5 years from now. And so then that helps businesses do long-term planning and decide, should we suck resources away from more current potential uses and sink them into a long-term investment project that might, we think, have a large amount of fruits, metaphorically down the road, but we have to wait longer for those things, to come online, to, shoot out of the pipeline. And so the interest rate, or the nexus of interest rates and the different, the yield curve and everything, that's what gives the feedback on that. Okay. So now finally, to answer your question, Jacob, the Austrian view says if the banking system, which if there is a central bank, the central bank, can be driving the process, but even if there's not a central bank, like this can still happen just with the regular banks if they're acting in concert, if it floods the credit markets with credit that's not really backed up by genuine saving, by the consumers, the households, then interest rates get pushed down to artificially low levels. And now interest rates are not actually serving their purpose. They're like the wrong prices. It's making it look like there's more savings available than society really did, save. Okay. And so Mises said that that's what is, the boom phase of the business cycle, where there's this apparent prosperity, but it's an illusion because it's not based on genuine saving. But for a few years, there's enough savings in the system, and the production process is so long term in an advanced economy that for a while things seem great, and it's only gradually that the chickens start coming home to roost. Okay, and then in a typical cycle, because of various red flags going off and alarms, the banking system backs off of that. They let interest rates rise, and then that's when the crash happens. Okay, so that's the basic Austrian story of what causes the business cycle. And so then in that framework, if there's a central bank, the whole function of a central bank is to encourage banks to lend, to pump in more credit. The natural checks on individual banks in a more laissez-faire environment where there isn't a central bank, the banks would be much more reticent to lend freely, especially during a downturn. And so that the point is, if the Austrians are right about what causes the business cycle, then you realize, the central bank, even if it's doing, quote, what it's supposed to, is actually the thing that's like exaggerating the problem. It's adding fuel to the fire, and it's just causing this ever increasing, frequency of booms and then more severe busts.
Right, because it would be like you would say, like a natural free market with a private banking system would still have periods of expansion and then contraction, but that would be much more stable compared to when the central bank comes in and you introduce all the problems of what you just went over, the improper signals by just sort of like arbitrarily changing the interest rates. That exaggerates that natural cycle to where now it's not just like periods of kind of stable contraction and stable growth, but rather like big booms and then big busts.
Yeah, if I could add one last thing, and I realize I prefaced it by saying I'll try to err on the succinct side, and your listeners are probably like, well, geez, I'm glad he didn't go for the verbose exposition. What typically happens is, when we're, quote, in a bad economy, like if there's a recession, and that's, and oh, geez, unemployment's 8%, and this is awful, and oh, wow, the businesses are languishing, and what do we, the Fed in the U.S. context, or the ECB if you're in Europe, whatever, they need to slash interest rates. They need to, get a shot in the arm to the economy. And so the point is, in the Austrian view, why are we in a recession right now? Why is unemployment 8%? It's because, we're suffering the fallout from a prior unsustainable boom. And so the worst thing to do right now is to then flood the market again with cheap credit and push interest rates to artificially low levels. All you're doing is just fueling the next cycle. And then, 8 years from now, we're going to be scratching our heads saying, geez, how come unemployment's 9%? What the heck? I guess that's free market capitalism for you. So in the Austrian view, it's the bust that's actually the recovery and like the returning, to sanity, even though it's painful. And, people use metaphors like a drinking binge or something, and that, the hangover is terrible, but that's actually when your body's repairing. The worst thing to do, like if you're suffering withdrawal from heroin, is to say, oh, this poor guy, let's give him some more heroines, to ease his pain, to get him through this. Like, no, the only way you're going to get off this cycle is if you just go cold turkey, right? So there's those kinds of analogies.
Right, of course. And then I think another thing we should try to explain and you can only explain this, as briefly as is possible. It's not going to be like a 2-sentence answer, but because I know a lot of people are confused on this, where people will see the jokes about the money printers going burr and tying that to the Federal Reserve, and it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. But one of the reasons we also criticize the Federal Reserve is their contribution to the process of creating more money and thus causing inflation in society, as well as the endless supply of money being connected to a lot of the other things that libertarians criticize, like endless spending and war and stuff like that. So again, just so that everyone kind of understands why, what the fundamental critiques are and kind of why this is important before we get to sort of then some of the pushback that people are giving.
Okay, sure. So, that a minute ago, I just kind of quickly went through and said, and so it's like the banks pumping in artificial, credit that's not backed up by saving. But more concretely, like what does that mean? So yes, the banking system in the act of granting loans is creating dollars in the U.S. context, right? That if people are familiar, like M1, M2, things like that, like checking account balances, if you add up everybody, what do they think they have on deposit at Citibank and Bank of America and blah, blah, blah. The banks can actually expand that just by granting more loans. Okay. But part of that, like what helps regulate that, or, what guides them in that is the underlying supply of like what's legal tender base money. All right. So Bank of America cannot create legal tender US dollars, whereas the Federal Reserve can, right? So the Federal Reserve, if it buys $1 billion worth of treasury bonds from a dealer and then credits that person's account such that, it writes them a check electronically for $1 billion, there's a new $1 billion of what's called base money. That's legal tender money. That's as real as if they just literally ran the printing press and printed up $100 bills to buy the thing. Okay. And then those reserves are like the basis upon which the commercial banks can then pyramid things on top of that. All right. So when, why is it that stuff is so much more expensive now than in 1950? Well, loosely speaking, it's because there's a lot more dollars in circulation. And so what is it that creates the dollars? It's the banking system in conjunction with the Federal Reserve that ultimately, it controls how many US dollars there are in existence, broadly defined.
Wait, I thought prices rose because of corporate greed.
Yes, and greed just it goes up and down depending on how many dollars exist.
Exactly. Good. I think that's a good. So because of all the arguments that you've given here, and like again, we kind of gave the so we're 17 minutes in, so we gave like the 15-minute like Reader's Digest of this. These are why you commonly hear libertarians, especially like Austrian style libertarians, be very critical of the Federal Reserve. Ron Paul, of course, like those who know him know that one of his rallying cries of his supporters was "End the Fed," which, like, it's funny. Like, so when I first heard Ron Paul, a little anecdote, I was in high school. I was on my speech and debate team. And I was, of course, just fed a bunch of Keynesian crap in the classes I took. And so, like, whenever I talked about Ron Paul, I'd be like, this guy's crazy. He wants to end the Federal Reserve. He wants to abolish the income tax. And so it's funny when I'm, like, thinking back about those times. I was like, oh, yeah. No, those are I was right. I steel manned what he was for. I just I've come full circle in my interpretation of that. But of course, like, so end the Fed, that's a quick, easy line. Some people also will say, like, audit the Fed. But how practical would it be? So we see the problems here of the Federal Reserve. How practical would it be to abolish the Federal Reserve? Whether that was a phase out, like over a year, or whether that was like just I don't know, like some, magical Rothbard button where the Federal Reserve ceases to exist and privatization takes over. Is that actually like a useful rallying cry or suggested like approach to like how do we get ourselves out of this like current inflationary cycle with all these booms and busts? It's funny, like I was talking to you before we got on that like I'm noticing corollaries between what I'm reading in Provoked, Scott Horton's book, and this, because like the modern the Democratic economists of Bill Clinton's administration, of course, were like, it's the blind leading the blind. They're trying to help, former USSR privatize their economy, but they have no idea what they're doing because, their system's not privatized. And so they don't know how to do these proper transitions from a centrally planned economy to a private one. And they're kind of a corollary there to like, to some extent with central banking, there's an element of central planning there. And how would we go about transitioning that?
Yeah, let me just make two quick points before we dive into the mechanics of like how would you get rid of this if it makes sense. So one thing is I just want to stress the critique of the Fed, especially for people who, they're not so much interested in economics, but they're more interested in like the nefarious things the government does, and this could even be people like on the left that oh yeah, I'm really against all the wars that the capitalists inflict upon the third world or whatever. And so a big point in Ron Paul's rhetorical broadside against the Fed is that the Fed enables U.S. foreign policy. If you took away the Fed, and the reason, everything I said earlier, that's all true, but that would have been consistent with just if the Fed created all this new money and just kind of like mailed it to everybody every month, that would still cause the boom bust cycle and all that stuff, but it wouldn't be but that's not how that new money enters the system, right? So it's kind of a double whammy that we get the boom bust cycle the money gets diluted. There's rampant price inflation. Stuff keeps getting more expensive over time. And on top of that, the way the money comes in is the Fed basically buys the debt issued by the federal government. So it allows the federal government to borrow on much cheaper terms than it otherwise would be able to, so they can go spend, trillions of dollars more than they would be able to if they were constrained to just borrowing, getting real tax revenue and then borrowing from, people who were not backstopped by the Fed. All right. So there's all that.
Yes.
So now as far as, okay, so how do you get rid of this? One thing I really liked in Ron Paul's book, And the Fed, is he explained early on when it comes to, okay, how would you actually do this? Right. That, okay, yeah, you've sold us the Fed, the base is the dollar. And his point was, people think getting rid of the Fed means the US dollar would disappear at the same time. And he was stressing that, no, that's not the case. The dollar existed before the Fed. The Fed was created in late 1913 is when it, actually was created in terms of the legal statutes and whatnot. And obviously the dollar existed before then. And then even the predecessors of the Fed, it was called the first and the second bank of the United States, which were central banks, much less powerful than the Fed would end up being. And Andrew Jackson famously killed the second one, right? So there were long stretches in U.S. history where the U.S. dollar was the official money, but there was no central bank. Okay, so just conceptually, like, this isn't science fiction. Ron Paul's point was, since the Fed was created after the dollar, those things are logically distinct, and we could just get rid of it. Now, in fairness to the critics, and I know we're going to come back to some in particular in a moment, Jacob, but the people kind of saying, yeah, you Austro-libertarians, you talk a good game, but when crunch time comes, you don't really have practical proposals. It is true that it was pretty thin. Like, I went just in preparation for this podcast episode, Jacob, and tried to look up some bullet points, and it was, I know Ron Paul had a proposal in his End the Fed, but it was hard to go find a bullet point. I even went and found Thomas Massey. He had a proposal for ending the Fed that came out recently, and it was only 4 pages, and I went and read it, and it's cool insofar as it goes, but it was basically just saying, yeah, the Fed should sell off all of its assets or liquidate its assets in an orderly manner, and then transfer all the liabilities to the Treasury, and then pay everyone's pensions and stuff that they're owed, and the end. And that arguably could cause a huge crash, right? So doesn't mean it's a deal breaker, but I'm just saying I could see how somebody say, whoa, that's kind of reckless, right? So let me just mention, Jacob, I don't know if this is what you want, but what's interesting in terms of a sort of intermediate thing where the authority for issuing U.S. dollars gets transferred back to the Treasury in some capacity, like, it could be a sub-agency in there or whatever, possibly like the U.S. Mint, but we would get rid of the central bank, but yet we still have the dollars. So I think the gain would be getting rid of, like, the discretionary ability. You don't want to have this entity that is out there and can just on a whim go buy a bunch of, like, hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, which, since 2008 could be mortgage-backed securities, right? So the Fed really, under Bernanke, just started doing all kinds of unprecedented stuff under the cover of the financial crisis, right? So, they have a printing press, and they could just do whatever the heck they want, basically, right? So you don't want to just give that to the Treasury and say, go at it. And so, for example, one proposal, like Ludwig von Mises wanted to tie the dollar back to gold. And so just so people can know, how could that be? Because people say, well, what are you going to do? Go back to $35 an ounce? That would be crazy. And yeah, that would cause a lot of pain. And so Mises' idea was to say, just announce the reform and say, yeah, we're tying the dollar back to gold. And then, set it at some future, like, say 3 months from now or whatever. And then just let the market price adjust, the global price of gold in US dollars adjust to this new reality as people in the market see, oh, they're serious, they're really going to do this. And the authorities would probably start stockpiling gold, to get ready for this transition. And then going forward, once, the date kicks in, his point was, it's just any new issuance of US dollars have to be backed up 100% on the margin at that ratio. So whatever you lock let's say it ends up being $3,000 an ounce. He's just saying, so what happens is then for any legal tender new US dollars to be issued, people have to come, anybody can do it, can go to the proper, U.S. authorities and hand over an ounce of gold, and then they go put that in a vault and then issue 3,000, new U.S. legal tender dollars to that person. It can be electronic or whatever. And so that was it. So it's not that all of the existing dollars automatically have 100% gold backing, but just going forward, any newly issued ones are 100% backed. And so his idea was over time, this system would asymptotically approach 100% gold-backed dollar, but there wouldn't be the sudden crash of a transition like where you had to drastically shrink the money supply in order to go back to 100% parity. Okay, so that was his idea. So that's a very practical, thing that relies on market forces, right? It's not central planners just trying to pick the gold price out of the air. They're letting the market set it and whatever. So to me, that if you wanted to keep the current dollar system, but then give it a more solid foundation, that's what you would do. Having said all that, though, my concern would just be, okay, we used to be on a gold standard and they went off it when there was a crisis. So rather than putting a bunch of political capital and effort, into getting everybody all fired up about going back on gold, to me, I would just try to open up the floodgates. Like if I'm, giving the Trump administration advice, I would just say, get rid of capital gains taxes on any kind of monetary instrument, get rid of any sort of legal tender requirements and things like that, right? Just open it up so that people in the jurisdiction of the United States have the ability to embrace different types of money, so we're not so dependent on the U.S. dollar. Like, to me, that's the best thing you could do, because in the long run, I don't want Americans using this money that's issued by the federal government.
Right. Well, actually, that's a perfect segue to kind of what we're one of the major things we wanted to talk about now that we've kind of set the stage here a little bit. I forget the exact timeline. I think this was like a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, sometime in the last 2 months. I saw a post where basically there were some, without getting into too many details, criticism launched at Libertarians and, Mises, Austrian style, believers in ending the Fed. And it wasn't the first time I had heard this. I'd also heard this on someone else's podcast who, his name is Matt Erickson. He's like kind of one of the people who used to call themselves like a post-libertarian. And, and I'd seen it before, so I was curious to look more into it. And both who Matt recommended, it is the same person who Pete was sharing. Pete Quinones was sharing a podcast episode where he talked to this guy, Tom. What's his last name?
Luongo.
Yeah, Luongo. Who I actually just I saw you've had him on your show too as well. Tom seems like a nice enough guy, knowledgeable of basic Austrian theory and stuff like that. But on Pete's show, when he talked to you and elsewhere, I've seen him and I've seen others who are, let's say like they're fellow travelers of sort of like at least Austrian economics and sort of the Austrian economic worldview when it comes to that. Not all these people are libertarians anymore, but they at least understand like the problems of the theory that we all kind of just that you did a good job of kind of summarizing here at the beginning. They're like, yeah, that's good on paper, but we don't actually want to end the Fed right now. And actually, like the argument is, if I'm going to like summarize it in my own words, is the argument that is being offered that's a criticism towards the more like traditional like end the Fed, audit the Fed, like get away from central banking and things like that, is that, well, we need the Federal Reserve right now, and that actually even people like Jerome Powell and whatnot, as much as we might not trust them and that they're still operating on Keynesian principles, that what they're doing is actually something we should support, which is trying to get us, like, and us being the United States of America, to be less dependent and less tied, less at the whim of European interests and European, like specifically like European banking industry interests. And there's a whole list of different examples that they go through. Which that's a fair kind of like basic summary of like one of the other than also like I guess sometimes they mix in there like, well, we don't want to end the Federal Reserve today because like that would just be chaos or whatnot. But it's kind of like it'd be chaos, and it's the the globalists, the European interests and whatnot, they would just take over and they would have undue influence on us. So it's kind of like we need our own central banking that's more localized to our country to resist this more, ominous central banking that's kind of connected to things like the World Economic Forum and European banking interests. Is that good enough kind of summary? You have anything you want to add to that?
Sure. Everything you said I think is very fair and is a correct statement of what their views were. So yes, just so for the listeners, Jacob had sent me the podcast episode. I think it was late November. It ran of Pete Quinones having Tom Luongo on his show, and so we said, I don't want to be coy and subtweet them. Like let's say what we're responding to here or what I'm responding to, So Tom made a bunch of points, but for our purposes here, Jacob, I think the most interesting one was to say, look, in general, like you say, and the Fed's a great idea. I get it. And if we could do it, sure. But hey, there really isn't a bullet point of practical, proposals to do that, because Austrian libertarians are used to just kind of sitting in the corner and, making fart noises and stuff about how everyone else is an idiot and you've been so irrelevant politically that you can get away with doing that. But now, like, hey, this is crunch time. Trump's listening to people. And more specifically, Jerome Powell has really gone to war somewhat silently with, as you say, we could call them the globalists, or if you want to just break it up into factions, like the U.S. central bank. Now the Fed system is hostile against like the London people and the Davos crowd and those guys, and not because Jerome Powell is secretly a Rothbardian, but it's just more like if the five families in New York go to war with each other, and you're living down the street from one of the mob bosses, you probably want him to not get whacked. Like you probably would prefer that the mob boss who's like in charge of your neighborhood is the one who wins, just because that's probably going to be better for you personally. Right. So I think that's where he's coming from. And then, he specifically said right now, these idiots, if they got their way and we ended the Fed, that would just hand the globe over to the globalists. Right. Because there's this battle going on. And the only thing that's going to stop, these other parties from just taking and filling a power vacuum is if the U.S. dollar system, maintains its strength, and you don't maintain strength by, having indecision or like fumbling and transferring control over to the Treasury. And then every 4 years when there's a new administration, it's up in the air. Like, oh, what's the policy going to be now for the U.S. dollar policy? Right. Whereas with the Fed, say what you will about, these technocrats who've been in charge of it, but are they really independent and all that kind of stuff? But still, that was a more predictable thing, and people could kind of plan around that. So given that that's what we're grappling with here, Jacob, is the alternate point, I would just make a couple of things, and then obviously, Jacob, just take us as deep into this as you want to go for your audience. So one thing is, I would say, if I think a good analogy would be like, what if some candidate came along, some new president, and they were talking about abolishing the U.S. military, right? And there is a sense in which I can imagine someone saying, are you guys out of your mind? If we got rid of I agree. The U.S. military has been doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And yes, back in 1920, if the U.S. had just been isolationist and we just kind of had militias and then we would have been totally fine. It would have been Fortress America, and we wouldn't have needed, and we'd be totally fine right now. But that's not what happened. We've had rampaging empire. And so right now, if we just turned all that off, we would get blown to smithereens, right? I could see that being a plausible concern if right now, next Thursday, we just turned off the military. But having said all that, like if I had the power to do it, would I do? I still think that would probably be in the long run the best thing to do, right? Because I think what's even crazier, which is more ridiculous, is to say, oh no, we're going to have this great plan to thread the needle and we're just going to gradually draw down the military. You know what I mean? That's not going to happen. And so I think if it plausibly were the case that in the next 4 years with this Trump administration, with Elon and this and meme coins and all kinds of crazy stuff going on, like it's just a nutty environment right now. Many things are politically possible that, this may be the only window. And so if they actually could end the Fed, I would take that. because I don't think it's good. Oh no, let's just do a gradual wind down and we'll do it over a 20-year period. It's not going away then. And so that's what I point. And then also too, it depends what you mean, right? I don't care what the globalists do if the U.S. authorities aren't punishing people for building, blockchain solutions. I mean, my day job at Infinio, I'm the chief economist at Infinio. We're doing all kinds of stuff using various blockchains and putting real world assets, and there's other, stable coins and this and that. And I'm saying a huge thing with all of that is the U.S. has, under the Biden administration, was so anti-crypto and anti-blockchain that people didn't want to develop stuff here. And the SEC regulates the heck out of things. So I'm just saying, if you even just had a 4-year window where you just knew, oh yeah, I'm not going to go to jail or the IRS isn't going to kill me if I develop something here, there would be a lot of stuff built and giving new tools to Americans for them to have all kinds of diversification possibilities, and to say, oh no, what are the BRICS countries going to do? Or what are the Davos? It's like, I don't care what they're going to do. Like, we've now built something that's very robust to give Americans financial freedom, not just, oh, for a while, the Fed right now is actually being pretty good. All right. So I guess that's what I was. And so the analog would be, just last thing I'll say here, Jacob, I know I've been going on off for a bit, is that, again, going back to the analogy of like if they got rid of the military, the worst thing would be if the U.S. still kept the military, right? So we still got taxed, $1 trillion a year to fund this whole thing, including the intelligence agencies and all this apparatus. But then they just sat back and didn't defend Americans from getting invaded. But also, if there were private paramilitary groups that sprung up to try to defend people with the, like bazookas and stuff, if the police and the U.S. Army went in and shut all them down and said, no, you can't do that, we're the Army, but then sat there and did nothing, while Mexican raiders came in and stuff, or, you know what I mean? Or the Chinese sent drones over to start blowing stuff up, and the U.S. the Air Force was just grounded and didn't do anything. But also, if anybody in the private sector tried to defend against that stuff, the U.S. authorities would shut them down. And so you can't do that. That would be the absolute worst outcome. So I'm saying, I agree if what they mean by end the Fed really in practice is just there's a lot of rhetoric and there's a lot of indecision and the Fed still exists, the dollar system still exists. It's illegal for you to try to, do a gold-backed currency or something out of North Dakota. You'll get in trouble for various, violations and tax laws and blah, blah, blah. And they just sit back and do nothing while, Klaus Schwab takes over. Yeah, that would be the worst possible outcome. But that's not what I would mean if I was going to say, no, if we actually had a shot to swing for the fences, yeah, I would end the Fed this presidential administration if we could. That's not what I would mean by that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I think, so I don't like this term, but like kind of what you're describing as like, well, this could be a worst case scenario is what some people call like an anarcho-tyranny, where it's like the government's
exactly.
kind of like, well, we have a monopoly on this and we've decided we're doing nothing, but also you're doing nothing, which is just like, well, then, yeah, like that is the worst case scenario with anything, whether that's defense, whether that's the border with immigration, and certainly you could, as you described, like that could happen with a sort of end the Fed sort of scenario where it's like, like, well, we're not gonna, do anything with our monopoly over the currency and interest rates, but we're not going to let private actors do anything or create alternate currencies, trade in alternate currencies, invest in other assets outside of things like the American markets. So yeah, that would be bad. I guess. So to what their point is then is part of your criticism or pushback, because I guess you would agree that maybe there is a potential threat there, but is a good way to put it in my own words is maybe the heart of your pushback that, well, while that is a concern, we're not going to be able to like centrally plan our own resistance to these other central planners and have that work out well as also like compared to what, right? Like compared to if we were to end the Fed and to do it in a way that's not the worst possible case scenario, where there is some implementation of private banks taking over, alternative currencies being allowed to be traded with, invested in, etc., as well as sort of like I guess part of it's also like, do we we know central planning is not that efficient. So like, and if we are moving more towards a free market, is our economy just going to grow and be wealthy enough that these foreign investors and bankers and whatnot who have maybe bad intentions, it's not going to get that far anyway, right? Kind of similar to like when we're talking about like private law and like chaos theory, like the idea like, well, if you have a population that is so rich and wealthy and independent, privately governing, like it's sort of like this is almost a corollary to the argument on that front, where they're like, well, what stops another state from coming in and taking over? And it's like, well, these people are, they're already kind of like in a culture of self-protection, self-determination. They don't have a fiat currency system or tax base to just take over and easily implement. So, and it's like the freer you are, the harder it is for other state actors to come in and like manipulate you. So that kind of like Steelman, kind of some of the pushbacks that we had, that you would have against like, well, we can't end the Fed now because of these, sort of like foreign actors.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, just to expound my perspective a bit more, it's funny because one of the running disputes I have with guys like George Gammon and Brent Johnson, the dollar milkshake guy, is they're talking about how there's this entrenched euro dollar system, and you guys don't understand. It would be really hard for the world to shift away from the dollar, and the context there is not talking about like the Davos crowd and this. It's more like I was on a zero hedge debate. Jim Rickards was my partner, and Brent and Michael Every were like on the other side. And we were talking about how the dollar wasn't going to be the global reserve currency by 2040. That's what we were arguing over. And we were, Rickards and I were making the point about, with all the stuff that the U.S. government has done, like against Russia with the sanctions and whatever, like it's a lot of countries who, it's not that they're ideological or that they're allied with Iran or something, but just they can see, whoa, if your economy is intertwined with like the SWIFT banking system and the U.S. dollar system, they have a lot of power over you. Like they don't even have to do formal sanctions or like they don't have to blockade your country. They can just turn off your money. And so, yeah, maybe we should get away. And so I'm arguing with other people, like I say, Brent and George Gammon and guys like that, who are saying it's going to be hard, even though the world in the abstract might want to switch to a BRICS currency or whatever, gold-backed currency, or, China does something itself, whatever, that there's just a lot of practical difficulties and the dollar's here to stay. Okay, so what I'm trying to get at is, I don't think realistically what it means is if next Thursday the Fed is going to like suck all the dollars on planet Earth back in and burn them. You know what I mean? Like when we talk about what does it mean to end the Fed, again, I think that's conceptually distinct from getting rid of the U.S. dollar is a thing, right? So that transition, there's better and stupider ways of doing it, but I think as long as they transitioned, that would just kind of accelerate that process of people getting away from the dollar. And so what I would do is say, the group of people in the economy that I really want to be able to diversify away from the U.S. dollar is the Americans. Like that's, for me, a big part of why I was pushing for Texas secession a few years ago, and I'm still in favor of that, and any other state that wants to break away, is that they could still use the dollar, obviously, just like in Mexican restaurants and tourist areas. You're going to accept the U.S. dollar. Of course you are. So, right, like the merchants in Texas could still be on the U.S. dollar system, but that wouldn't be their country's, the Republic of Texas would not be issuing U.S. dollars. They could, their people could diversify away from it. And so then in my view, when the chickens come home to roost and the dollar crashes, they would be more insulated from that. So that's kind of what I'm saying. I think the world in general is moving away from the dollar. Like certainly is a share of foreign exchange reserves right now. It's lower now than it was like in the year 2000, right? You just extrapolate those trends, it's going to be below 50%, I think by like 2043 or something like that, the last time I did the calculation, right? So it is happening right now anyway. And I'm just saying, I think that would be great if the U.S. authorities got all the legal and regulatory roadblocks out of the way for Americans to quickly diversify, to not be so tied into the dollar. Again, it's not going to switch over next Thursday. It's a network effect. One last thing I'll say here, Jacob. Like people would say, "Oh, you guys, the Mises Institute, when you go give talks and stuff, do they pay you in gold?" Like years ago, people would ask, and I say, "No, because we have to pay our bills in gold or in U.S. dollars, right? If they gave us gold, we would go sell it for dollars, unless we were just about to take dollars and go buy that much gold, and they happen to just save us the transaction cost by handing it over. You know what I mean? Like, what are the chances that would happen? Like, we're embedded in a U.S. dollar system, so that's still going to be the case. But in terms of if lots of people can agree this is a bad system, why aren't we getting away from it? Well, there are a lot of legal and regulatory things keeping us corralled. It's not purely a network effect. So yeah, just like Russia and China want to break out of that and get onto something away from the U.S. dollar system, so do Americans. And I think instead of trying to time that just right and say, oh, no, 3 years from now, then we'll allow it. Like, no, if you had the chance to do that now, I would start doing that right now.
Yeah, I think this gets to there seems to be, and this is a tough thread to needle. And you kind of brought this up earlier when we were just describing like even like what we would possibly do to move away from the Fed, and sort of like a central bank system. Is that there are I like this quote from Jordan Peterson where he says like there are snakes everywhere. And it's like there is no path forward that doesn't have some kind of trade-off, right? That's basically the Thomas Sowell quote, right? Like there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Like we don't have a path forward that doesn't come with some sort of risk. But we have to not just like I almost feel like when I was listening to Pete and Tom talk that there's sort of an assessment of just the risks of resisting of like moving away from the Fed because they're like, oh, but like the Fed is, and again, I'm trying to like, I don't want to throw shots or be like insulting to them, but it came across to me as just kind of sounding similar to like what the typical statist response is to anything, which is just like, well, like, you know, how without this state program, like how like the state program is going to protect us from this potential danger. How are we going to protect ourselves without the state? That kind of boils down to most like objections to libertarianism, and it's like, well, yeah, like there are issues there, I guess, that are potentially there, but you have to also weigh those risks against the benefits, which is kind of what you were alluding to, of moving away from the Fed, which would be like as long as that's not done in the worst case scenario and people can quickly diversify their assets and invest in other things, then yeah, like being free and wealthy, like I was alluding to before, is a kind of a good bulwark against a lot of these problems. Do you think that because and Pete is harder for me to judge, and I don't want to try to speculate where he's at. I've talked to Pete before. He's always been good with me, so there's no I don't have any issue with Pete on a personal level. I know he's moved away from libertarianism. I don't know Tom as well, and it's like, is it like a lack of trust in free markets that's motivating him, or is it just more of a like, you know, being particularly like fearful of the thing he sees, and like maybe that's a potential like we can't read their minds, I don't know, but it's not just them. There seems to be a lot of people who have, and to their credit, there is some persuasive power to this idea of like, well, yeah, like, you know, in an ideal society we would all just, you know, private property from, you know, east to the west, but like if it's a choice between nationalism and globalism, we'd rather go with nationalism. And I think like that even goes to some of the stuff we touched on when we talked on the last time I had you on the show, which is that it seems some libertarians are drawn into that sort of like we have to just use nationalism as a bulwark against globalism, even if that means accepting certain things that we know are, you know, not ideal. And to some extent, like, listen, like, yeah, like, I want the military to be privatized. But if the transition step is we bring the military home and we still have a, you know, standing military, so to speak, and it's socialized defense, but they're just protecting our borders, so to speak. I don't mean that literally, by the way. I'm not a like Dave Smith joked about. I'm not saying put all the military on the border and point them towards Mexico and Canada, but just like, you know, like figuratively speaking, like just they're at home defending the actual homeland, and they're not all over the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not perfect, but like yeah, I'd rather us be a republic than empire. So do you think that's part of like what's motivating this sort of debate here, and how do you where do you sit in that? Like how do you navigate that sort of tension?
Okay, so a lot there. Let me just try to make some points in response. So one thing is, I will, in his heated criticisms of guys like me and my colleagues, one thing Tom said that I will acknowledge. He said something like, there's not a lot of these Austro-libertarian college professors who even know what the what a euro dollar is, or he said something like that. And there's like analysts out there like Jeff Snyder and me, Tom, we know way more about that, and they got to come to us because we're the ones. So that is true, right? And you can expect. I don't think that's a huge indictment, but yeah, if you're a tenured college professor and you're teaching macro classes, and you got to grade papers and stuff. That's what you're going to be doing, and your role is to talk about the theory, and you're not tracking pork bellies or something, and that's not just your thing. You're not writing an investment newsletter for subscribers. So that's true. But having said that, though, again, I think, put it this way, I think U.S. dollar hegemony is eroding over time, and the stuff that has been happening with Russia and the Middle East or whatever, that there might be a temporary thing where the neocons look like they're on top or whatever, but I think that's really just going to further. Everyone around the world knows 10 years from now, we do not want to be dependent on Washington, D.C., keeping our access to the international banking system open. Like, we do not want them to have that power to just flip a switch and then our country is out of the global economy, which is what they showed they could do to Russia, right? So I think the U.S. dollar system is shrinking, and what I'm trying to emphasize is just, again, and I'm getting this because of the last 2 years of me working in this, like the financial sector, but talking, the interaction between like insurance companies, banking and blockchain applications, and just that whole, those types of firms and whatever. And it's like, just think of it right now, people go and they start companies where there's really favorable tax and regulatory treatment like this. Oh yeah, we're headquartered, in this nation over here. Why? Because, that's all everyone knows. That's where you go to set up your headquarters, and you do that. Can you imagine if the U.S. were the global mecca and everyone just knew, oh yeah, if you go and develop in the U.S., you're going to be totally safe. Kind of like how now, Snowden or somebody, they'll go to Russia, like, for protection. So can you imagine if for a 4-year stretch, every entrepreneur that wanted to set up something that would be a rival, not just to the U.S. dollar, but to whatever the BRICS countries are going to do in terms of money, knew, oh yeah, you just go and incorporate in the U.S. and you launch it out of there, and you have the full protection. Somebody who wanted to shut you down from China or whatever, they would have to fight the U.S. to get at you. Like, can you imagine how strong that would be? So that's kind of what I'm trying to get people to realize, that when we say, oh yeah, these idiots, if we were to end the Fed, then Davos wins. Not if what end the Fed means is the U.S. is unleashed. Again, your anarcho-tyranny is perfect, Jacob, that if what we mean is, that whole system, the taxation, everything is all there. U.S. nobody wants to go start a business in the U.S. because, oh, what's the SEC going to do to me? And they sit back and do nothing and let the BRICS countries and Davos and whatever take over. The rest of it, sure, but Davos can't take over if there's stuff being launched out of the U.S. that is an alternative, and people in these other countries can go ahead and download the app on their phone, and, oh yeah, I have a whole diversified thing, and I got all these different crypto coins, and I got gold stored safely in a vault in Pennsylvania, and I know that I'm you get what I'm saying? Like, it's hard to even imagine that right now, because everybody just knows, oh yeah, the U.S. is awful, and you don't want to start a crypto business there because of the last the Biden administration. But I'm just saying, okay, but if that's what it is, then the Fed's not being ended. So I want people just to be consistent and understand what the possibilities would be if we actually did get rid of the Fed.
Right. The other thing that comes to mind, which I wonder if you would agree with this, is even if, let's say this played out the way they thought, right? It's like we keep the Federal Reserve, and somehow the Federal Reserve's policies over the next 5 years really beat back these European actors and whatnot, and then America continues to reign supreme economically somehow through that. But then we still have, as you mentioned, the American hegemony across the world, which ties into the military, industrial complex and all the military inventions that are going on over there. And as we know from the last 20 years of history, is that the expansion of tyranny across the world from the American empire eventually gets weaponized through things like the Patriot Act and surveillance and whatnot towards the American people. And so it's like, could this just be like, all right, like you're going to ward off this potential problem now, and then just like, okay, and then like it's still going to be a globalist regime ruling you. It's just, instead of a European globalist regime, it'll be the American like globalist regime that's still mucking about in all these. So it's almost like I almost feel like it's one of those things where like they I think you're right. They see, ooh, America's weakening, but they're like, man, that's a little scary, because if America's weakening, like, what comes on the other side of that? And we don't want to be ruled by European interests. It's like, yeah, but like that's why what we just have to push for is the actual path forward of, I think, just full privatization of and don't allow that worst case scenario to happen. So would you think that's potentially like a, I don't know, is that an observation that you would agree with?
Yeah. So just to go back to the crime families in New York City analogy I used before, when I was saying, to give Tom and maybe Pete, to the extent that he agreed with Tom's view, it's due. Yeah, you can understand it, like a hypothetical thing where, yeah, if you live down the street from a mob boss and he goes to war with the other ones, you kind of want him to win. But just to flesh that out more, if he's shaking you down and 50% of your income goes to the guy who lives down the street from you, because otherwise, his goons come and burn your shop down. And if he gets knocked out in this war, it's going to be at least 5 years before the other families move in, and you have time, you and your neighbors, to build up, defenses. And you fully recognize, no, there was a sense in which half my neighbors, for whatever reason, thought the guy down the street was their buddy. And every time I talked about, yeah, isn't that guy kind of like a mob boss? And they looked at me like I was nuts. But everyone knows for sure, oh yeah, these other families from across, the other boroughs coming over, clearly those are just, invaders that maybe actually would want to do that, right? So there's that element that, and also too, it's not like the U.S. military going around and rampaging and doing regime change and stuff. It's not like, well, given that somebody's going to be toppling governments around the world, I want it to be the CIA, so at least that keeps Americans safe. No, that's not true at all, right? So I would say there's that element as well. And whether that's just because, oh yeah, central planning is difficult, whether it's, with economic planning or trying to rebuild societies at gunpoint, or if it's, no, the CIA is so bad that actually, yeah, they do stuff that they know full well is not keeping American, I don't know. But clearly, in practice, the CIA going around and knocking regimes off that aren't, quote, pro-American is not helping the average American any. And so, again, even though I understand where they're coming from to say, oh, right now, yeah, you want somebody like Powell sticking up for Wall Street and going and sticking it to, the ECB or whatever, right, but I'm not sure that actually helps me any. Like, to say, is the euro dollar system going to flourish or not? I don't really understand how that affects people in Memphis too much. I think way more is the IRS and the Fed debasing the dollar for people in Memphis. I think that's way more important to them than, what currency are people doing invoicing in Brazil.
I mean, I guess, is there any concern of like, I guess I think we already kind of covered this, like if it's an anarcho-tyranny sort of situation, but like, or if it's maybe something in the middle where like we don't get everything we want. It's not the worst case scenario, but it's not great. Like, we already, see reports of like foreign countries coming in and like buying up massive lots of property and things like that, and that hurts us. So I guess there's like, and this kind of gets into what I wanted to touch on. Like, we can kind of keep on some of the things we've already opened up, but I also want to tie in like a little bit of trying to project what the incoming Trump administration might do with some of this stuff, because you get the sense that like kind of what Pete and Tom are talking about is sort of also what I think Trump and his team are somewhat reacting to, and it's this sort of protectionist strain that's within the Make America Great Again, the MAGA Maha sort of coalition, which again, like there's a lot of things about the sort of Trump, MAGA, Maha, RFK, Vivek Elon, Doge, all that. Like, there's a lot of stuff there that's like, hey, I like that. I like that. That's cool. Like, like I kind of, the way you put it, like there's unique opportunities here that we haven't had in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But there is also this sort of protectionist strain that I'm also worried about, like that could contribute towards maybe not the worst case scenario, but an outcome where, like, imagine if they like restrict the Fed to some extent, but then it's like, oh, we're also introducing tariffs, and we're so that's hurting the American economy, and then it still doesn't do enough to stop foreign investors and whatnot from buying more American property, which continues to hurt American consumers. Again, like this is one of the you can, I guess, play out like a million different scenarios for a million different possibilities. But what do you think in terms of like what Trump's proposals are, and where, like, if there's any that you think, okay, this would be good if he implements this, but then like, okay, if they go this route, okay, that could rapidly escalate some of these problems we've been talking about.
All right, so you're right. There's a lot of good and bad in the people advising Trump, and I don't even mean like in terms of foreign policy. I think everybody knows, like, oh yeah, some of those people are awful and others are better. But even domestically in terms of economics, that, for example, Vivek Ramaswamy, a lot of great instincts, and I think he's very sharp and eloquent. But I have written articles and done podcast episodes picking apart his support for tariffs, right? And it's not, he gives a very sophisticated case for it, but I still think it's wrong, right? And so that it runs a spectrum of MAGA type people who are pro tariff. It could be something as innocuous as, oh yeah, we know free trade is the best in a vacuum, but, or the first best outcome, but we don't have that. The government's going to tax a lot, and I'd rather them do it with tariffs than the income tax. And if we could, cut government spending enough such that we could get rid of a lot of income tax, perhaps even phase it out altogether and just replace it with tariffs, that would be great. I would agree with that. I don't want to get too bullish behind that, because I think in practice you would just end up with both, because the income tax takes in so much revenue right now. If you tried to match that dollar for dollar with tariffs, there wouldn't be imports. Like, you would just seal the U.S. off and you wouldn't get any revenue anyway, right? So it wouldn't work unless they drastically cut spending. If they could do that, great, but I would be surprised if they could pull that off. Okay, so there's that stuff. But then all the way the spectrum of, oh yeah, tariffs are great. They keep jobs here and they make America richer, and the U.S. took over the world economically under protection of tariff, right? So there's that element where it's just like, bro, do you even Bastion? So, so that is kind of disheartening. And again, it just an argument with those people too is they're very smug and just like, oh yeah, you libertarians with your thought experiments, but in the real world, do you know how much IP China steals? Stuff like that. And okay, but China steals IP, so then why is taxing Americans gonna stick it to China? You know what I mean? Right. So anyway, I guess to come around to your question though, I am not, of all the stuff going on. Them hiking up tariffs a lot would be bad, but to me that's not. It's kind of like the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the early 30s were bad, but I don't think that's, when I tell the story of the Great Depression, I don't even bring those up unless the person interviewing me brings it up. So I think that's kind of where we are now, that like as we're talking here, Jacob, the yield curve finally uninverted. The Fed, as we record, just cut short-term rates. And, I think the massive inflation they had is, there's going to be a crash now that they managed to postpone. And yeah, if they also jack up tariffs on top of that, that's going to be bad. But I think we're going to have a crash either way. So for me, the tariffs, to me, it's more just frustrating because, again, all these people that are nominally in favor of the free market are also talking about how great taxes are at promoting manufacturing jobs or something.
Which doesn't get even to like the root cause of why manufacturing left America in the first place, which is like it had much more to do with tax policies and overregulation and things like that, which caused a lot of people to like, oh, okay, it's cheaper and easier to go do manufacturing, other things. And I remember so where I live in Pennsylvania, I'm close to like Hershey, and I remember when Hershey moved a lot of their plants down to Mexico, which everyone was really outraged by and whatnot. And I get it. It sucks. People lose their jobs, and I guess like there's something about like, ooh, we should have a strong manufacturing base that like it makes kind of intuitive sense, but then it's kind of like, okay, but like if you want that, address the core reasons that cause the manufacturing to decline in the U.S. At the same time, though, like there is no magic rule that says, well, a country has to have a strong manufacturing base in order to be free and to thrive, right? Like, or even if it does, like, it doesn't mean like maybe a couple states in the North American continent are good at manufacturing and others aren't. Like, so I don't know. Like, it's tough because again, it's like that dichotomy of I get it. We don't like people are afraid of globalists and global interests and World Economic Forum and all that. Like, I get that. I'm not saying I'm not concerned about it either. And insofar as the like isolationist, protectionist sentiment is also paired with let's bring the troops home, it's like, okay, like I like that, but at the same time, like, we need to, I guess, keep having conversations like this with, and hope that people listen. Those in Trump's orbit, to hear more of these libertarian free market ideas, because I guess we're heading for a crash either way, I guess, but how long of a crash is it going to be? How hard is the recovery going to be? Is going to be, I guess, somewhat impacted by what Trump does when he comes into office, what policies he implements. Tariffs probably aren't the deal breaker either way, but they're certainly not. It wouldn't be helpful. It would probably also hurt in the sense of like what opportunity cost it would bring, like in terms of like what investments, what advancements could be made in the sort of like recorrection that maybe tariffs would stifle if they're present. So I don't know. I guess other than tariffs, like, I know Trump ran first time in 2016 on.
Well, can I just say one thing on that?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Just again on the trade deficit and all that stuff. With all this stuff, there is the difficulty. It's sort of like with the shooting of the United Healthcare CEO and then the debate over the U.S. healthcare system. On the one hand, I don't want to just concede that, oh yeah, the U.S. system's awful. To the leftists, like, no, there's a lot of. It's the best the money can buy, right? Like if you're a wealthy couple in Europe and your kid, you have a newborn who really needs something, you probably want to come over and have them treated in the U.S. like the best pediatric hospitals on planet Earth and stuff like that. Certain types of cancer treatments or whatever, your survival rate's going to be higher in the U.S. But yet, the system is awful, so you don't want to say, oh yeah, capitalism for the win. And likewise here, you're right. It's tricky. Like if jobs get outsourced or whatever, that on the one hand, you do come off as being obtuse if you just do like, well, if we imagine a too good model and then clearly the comparative advantage says this, and that it's like, okay, but that's not, people say, we don't have free trade right now. And so it's like, right. So then why are you getting mad at free trade? You know what I mean? So it's almost like the critics do the exact same thing. They rip on free trade and then you start making an argument about why free trade is good. They go, but we don't have free trade. It's like, okay, so then why are you mad at it? So anyway,
it's Schrodinger's free market, right? It's like it's always the free market's fault. But then when we say we want to use free markets, it's like, I mean, that's just a fantasy. Like, well, which is it?
So I get that, and you're right to point out that there's a lot of other things going on as to why is it that it would be impossible, to make TVs in Philadelphia right now, or, oh yeah, we used to have manufacturing and I got outsourced. Also too, with that, I think sometimes people might not appreciate, while you were talking, I was trying to pull it up, Jacob. I can't find the right graph on Fred. It's not as if the U.S. isn't manufacturing stuff, right? It's the number of workers in manufacturing has definitely fallen, but by the same token, fewer people work in agriculture now than in the year 1900, but we still grow more food, right? So just to be clear, in the 2000s, the total output did actually start going down, right? So I'm not saying U.S. manufacturing output just keeps going up year after year. That it did turn around, but I'm saying the U.S. manufactured more stuff in the year 2000 than it did in the year 1990. Put it that way, okay? Just so people understand what we're talking about here. It's that productivity went up per worker. But anyway, the one thing that would certainly promote U.S. exports and bring down the trade deficit without the need for tariffs is if the U.S. government just cuts spending, right? That when the U.S. government runs a budget deficit and has to borrow money, what does that do? That pushes up interest rates. that makes U.S. debt more attractive to foreigners. So they buy more treasuries, and so they use their currencies to buy dollars, and so that strengthens the dollar and makes it harder for us to export. So even if you did nothing else, if Trump just comes in and with Doge and whatever, if they just cut federal spending by $500 billion, that would actually weaken the dollar. That might surprise some people, but that would be the effect because interest rates would be lower, U.S. interest rates, and that would make it easier for U.S. exporters to sell abroad because now their stuff would be cheaper to foreigners. So again, a lot of these things that's going on that, yeah, it's not just environmental regulations or OSHA and stuff like that. That's all true. Even just the huge U.S. government deficit makes the dollar artificially stronger and makes it harder for us to export.
Yeah, I remember, I can't remember which one I was listening to, but when Tom was talking about how the, when the Fed was at one point, the policy was to like prioritize selling the short-term treasury bonds that had a higher yield than the long-term ones that had a lower one, and it was like, and that's bad because that was playing into foreign interests and whatnot and hurting us, and it's just like so, and that kind of played into their defense of like, well, that's why we need to, flip the script and use the Federal Reserve to, enhance Americans. Like, and I was just like, but like this whole thing, as you just kind of alluded to, is like, well, no, like the problem is you created the mechanism for artificially setting interest rates and creating a game where people are going to, buy debt to their advantage, which is, actually, again, I keep going back to provoked, but like similar things happened in post-Soviet Russia when they were trying to, implement economic changes there, and there was so much like people buying, government debt and stuff at, wild, crazy interest rates and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, but again, the problem there was they tried to replace one form of central planning with another flawed form of central planning. And it's like, we're at some point, it feels like, if you squint at it and only look at like one side, certain variables, you can try to convince yourself it's better. But I always come back to like, I think what you're doing is just saying it's 6 in one and half a dozen in the other. Like both scenarios end up with the American people, the American worker, the American, what's left of the American middle class getting absolutely, destroyed and eviscerated. And like we can compare which routes of central planned economies are less destructive, or we can just do what we can to move towards, actual free market solutions. It seems like it's, and yeah, granted, to their point, and this is kind of what I wanted to end on, I do get the criticism that some libertarians can spend so much time in theory that they aren't out there trying to make realistic in-paths towards advancing, any of our ideas of, Austrian economics, libertarian, ideas of government, decentralization into practice. And there's certainly, and I'm sure you see it as much as I do, a lot of infighting within libertarian circles, because the ones who were out there trying to do things are often ascribed as like, oh, you're selling out your principles, you're compromising too much, and then they'll shoot back and be like, well, what are you doing? And so like, what do you make of that sort of dichotomy, and how do we balance trying to find like the pragmatic solutions that aren't like, diluting our principles down to the point to where like we're not effectively doing anything? Because it's sort of like I forget where I heard this analogy before. Actually, I think it was Michael Heiss who used this analogy to me. It's kind of like there's like physics and applied physics, right? It's like, because like you learn when you first learn physics, kind of like when you first learn libertarian like economics, Austrian economics, like it makes sense in terms of like, this is how money works, this is how interest rates work, things like that. And then you're trying to apply it in the real world with all the like state interventions, all the distortions, and trying to figure out like, well, how do we move in a positive direction? That's like applied physics. Like it's a lot harder, but we do need to try to do something, right? It's like, what do what is your sense of how we as like libertarians can kind of move forward and try to reconcile that tension?
Yeah, so this thing, it reminds me, I'm not going to get the wording right, and George Carlin said it funnier, but it's something like, you say, you ever notice when you're driving that someone going 5 miles per hour slower than you is like this annoying grandma, and anyone going 5 miles faster than you is this crazy lunatic, right? And so his point was, that No, it's just you think what you're doing is right, and everybody else who's differ is wrong for the corresponding reason. And so likewise, yeah, it's a lot of the people who before the takeover were like, oh yeah, I'm very pure, and anybody doing anything in the LP is this sellout, and just, oh, you just want to hobnob with people in your cocktail parties in DC. And then once they took over, it was like, and anybody criticizing them, like, well, gee, that seems kind of an unprincipled thing you're doing, and you're allying with Republicans, and you're doing that, and you're having this guy come and it's like, yeah, at least we're doing something. You're just sitting on your ass, you know what I mean? So it's again, I'm not saying it's a literal contradiction, and the things were different. I get it. I'm not saying it's exact mirror image, but it just did seem funny to me that a lot of the people that I know would have been the ones like, shooting spitballs from the corner when they were on the sidelines, and then when they got in there and they realized like, oh wow, we actually might influence things. Like it's different, right? And I, if I were a U.S. senator and my vote actually was one of 100 that would do something, like I would take things a lot more seriously than, recently. Like I didn't vote for Trump, and people got mad at me. You would appreciate. I wrote in Jesus of Nazareth, Jacob, right? So you can appreciate it. But my easy way out of that was I live in Massachusetts. My vote wasn't going to do anything anyway, right? And so if I'm going to go around and people ask me and I want to tell a story, I want to talk about Jesus more than I want to talk about Donald Trump, right? So, but if I thought my vote was actually going to be the difference between Kamala and Trump, I wouldn't have been so glib about it, right? I still would have been a Christian, just to be clear, right? So you get the point that, yeah, it's tricky with this stuff. So I guess the big principles are, I think Rothbard agreed with this and wrote this out. You should always favor something that is an improvement in liberty, right? So if right now the tax rate is 40% and they lower it to 37%, you should applaud that. You shouldn't say, I oppose that because it should be zero, taxation is theft, right? You should still say the goal is to make it zero, not just say, okay, the war is won, we got it down to 37%, that's fine. No, you should make the principled arguments and remind people that, yes, this is unfair. Just like if you lived under slavery, you got to be an abolitionist. But that doesn't mean if they stop, if they only whip the slaves half as much, that you should say, no, that still sucks. No, you should applaud that and say, yeah, good. You should free them. But yeah, that's a good job. I'm glad now that you put in new people who don't whip them as much, right? So I think that there's that element that, yeah, you don't want to be such a purist that movements in the right direction you just criticize because you're saying, oh, that's just half measures. Now, the tricky thing, though, is in practice, usually there aren't just unambiguous improvements in liberty. Usually things are a hodgepodge and it's some good and some bad. And then you got to say, well, are you going to be a purist and say, no, if this policy, like for example, Jacob, I was tasked with, for a California-based think tank, to come up with a proposal to take the California state income tax and make it a flat tax, right? Because they had like 5 different graduated levels, just at the state level, and the top rate was ludicrous when you combine it with the federal. But my mandate was you got to keep it revenue neutral because otherwise it's not going to be politically feasible. Well, the only way to do that would be to raise taxes on some people. There was no way I could mathematically do that I'm going to make them all, take what's 5 brackets now, make it one rate with one standard deduction, and then nobody's tax goes up. That's impossible, right? So, I wrote the thing, but again, even there, partly I slept at night because I knew they're not actually going to implement this, right? That I'm going to start a conversation and maybe down the road, you know what I mean? So it gets really tricky when you want to do something. And, that's why for me personally, I would not go into office. If Donald Trump or, Vivek or somebody wants to call me and wants my advice, I will give them advice on stuff. But no, I would not want to be actually in office, partly because I don't think there's any way I can do that that's consistent with my morals. But given there are people doing that, I certainly want them to do it more humanely or more intelligently than viciously and stupidly. And that's why I'm not afraid to say something, even though I know it could be, that, oh, you shouldn't advise. It's like, people get mad at Milton Friedman for advising Pinochet. And, I'm not saying there couldn't be a wrong way to, there could be some people that, you don't want to go and advise Stalin and say, well, I got Stalin to, run the gulag 10% more efficiently. So I think I did a good job. No, there's some people you say, no, I'm not dealing with you. I'm not saying with Friedman, with Pinochet, I don't know enough about what had Pinochet done to that point, whatever, to render. But I'm saying the principle that, there are things that are deal breakers, but in general, just to give advice to imperfect people who are running an imperfect system, at some point it's like, well, yeah, if all the people who know what's going on keep their mouths shut, then it's going to be worse. And I don't think that's actually the right thing to do.
There's a really bad joke about Milton advising Pinochet on how more efficient ways to build helicopters in there.
Uh-huh.
I'll save that for the internet to make. But, well, that's a good segue to, I guess, my last question, which is like, because this is not only, you kind of hinted at it, this isn't just a tough quandary for libertarians, right? Like Christians, I think, struggle with this as well in terms of like, how do Christians engage in politics without compromising our principles? And on one hand, you have like maybe like a radical, what people would call like Anabaptist, sort of like retreatist mentality, which is just like, well, Christ's kingdom is not of this world, and we are called to be separate from the world, and so like, yeah, spread the gospel, build the kingdom of God in terms of like growing the visible church and invisible church, but other than that, like that's all a distraction, just live for spiritualize everything in some extent. And like, I'm a non-millennialist, so people accuse me of doing that sometimes as well. But on the flip side, then you have like another extreme, which is like, I've done a lot of coverage, as well as others here at LCI. I've done coverage on like the Christian nationalist movement and sort of more dissident right, movement, which is kind of like, I guess more tied to like a post-millennial view, but it's just like, no, actually our job is to make everything better, and that means like, if there's going to be a state and there's going to be power, then Christians should be in power, and they should just be passing laws that are just, Christian. And so, I kind of find myself as like in the middle, going like, well, I don't think that we're called to be so separate that we just kind of sit on the sidelines, but I also don't think that we're supposed to like just be like, oh, like, these earthly kingdoms just, they had the right idea. We just need to, implement Christian authoritarianism instead of, secular left progressive totalitarianism. And like the Bible has, so I actually just recently did a podcast episode on this where I kind of made the point, like, there are passages in the Bible that say, seek the common good and welfare of the nation you live in. And you see the, like, in the book of Daniel, in the book of Nehemiah, you see the Israelites, different figures, cooperating with earthly powers to promote some kind of good. Joseph worked with so it's like, worked with Pharaoh to do some good. So it's like, I don't know where that, it's hard to kind of draw a nice clean line. Like, people just want like a neat, fit on a bumper sticker kind of slogan, sort of like, here's what Christians do, right? But I don't know, I kind of feel like it's complicated, and I feel like you were kind of talking on that. So like, what are your thoughts on this, the Christian side of this, of like, how do we, engage in politics, make commentary on politics, try to like, influence those who were in that to do better, but without compromising our, because obviously, our allegiance should be in Christ alone. We should be wary of entanglements that would cause us to compromise our values. So it's kind of like, the path is narrow. So but how do you articulate that?
So great question. I can give some thoughts. I don't think we're going to have a formulaic answer. I think, I'm not trying to say this to be wishy-washy, but I think everybody's got to just decide for him or herself, as a Christian, this is what I think I am called to do. I will say, whatever somebody's job is or whatever they think they're supposed to do, I would rather they be like, have an epiphany and come to accept Jesus. So even if there's CIA people plotting to overthrow regimes, if somebody was an atheist and then he finds Jesus, I would feel good about that. Even if he stays in his job, I would feel much better thinking, I think that would at least, provide some kind of braking mechanism on him, that he would at least, wouldn't be maybe trafficking children to pedophiles or something, and say, no, that's where we draw the line. Let's keep it limited to narcotics. So anyway, I think that, and the Joseph example is great. Like, I use that a lot in different contexts, so especially about, God using evil things to turn to good. But you're right. I had never even considered that clearly there, God's plan was that, oh yeah, Joseph, you're going to advise Pharaoh. And it's not that I'm sure there were a lot of things Pharaoh did that God, that Pharaoh did that God was not cool with, but, still it prevented the famine and whatnot. So you're right. I think there's a role for that. Because also, too, there's a sense in which it's kind of silly to say, oh, no, as a Christian, I would never advise the U.S. government, because you can see that, the bicameral legislature, that's actually not consistent with, no matter what happens in the fallen world, it's not going to be New Jerusalem. You know what I mean? So there's almost a sense in which, okay, well then why do you even eat? Like, probably any food you get at your store, coercion was involved somewhere, so you should just die. That's the only way you cannot, you know what I mean? So
Right.
I think there is a sense that, but again, too, that doesn't mean, oh, so therefore anything goes, and people looking at you would have no idea you are a Christian, that you just look like everybody. So I get, I'm not giving a hard and fast rule here as to, oh, this is how you should go live. I mean, I say, oh, there are rules, like, go read the Gospels, and that's where you should come up with an idea of how should I conduct myself. I mean, just again, look at Jesus, right? He certainly did not take up an earthly position and fall into that, but he also definitely let the people in charge know how he felt about the way they were running things. So I think for sure we can say, yeah, we're on solid ground, speaking up. And he also didn't tell all the soldiers stop being soldiers or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's, even though I personally am sympathetic to Christian pacifism, a lot of people like to show, well, Jesus didn't tell the soldiers to do it. And I agree with that, right? Because I think there is a sense in which everything we do is, it's not going to be, we're in a fallen world, and it's, you know what I mean? So anyway, I hope I'm helping hit the ball back over the net here, but I don't have any bright line rules for you.
No, I think that's, I share a lot of the insights you gave there are kind of what my mind goes to as well, because it reminds me of when Paul's describing grace in Romans and stuff, and it's just now does grace exist that sin may abound? By no means. And it's this tension, well, we don't obey God out of a sense of legalism because we need grace, and it's only by grace we are saved and can be made righteous, but that grace doesn't give us a license to just do whatever we want. And it's kind of the same tension there that you're describing exists with sort of our role in the world. It's it's not, we shouldn't be isolationists to the world, but we also can't mix with the world where we become of the world, right? So it's that in the world, not of it. God hasn't called us out of it yet. We are to play a role in it. And yeah, I mean, it can sound wishy-washy to say you have to find your own, you have to find your lane, right? But I guess that's kind of what you have to do. It's a division of labor. Everyone's going to have different vocations, and God puts you in the spot he puts you in for a reason. So if he puts you in an area where your primary job is to engage culture and to engage in community activity, then do that. If he puts you in a role where it's I have the ear of powerful politicians, then use that to the best of your ability to faithfully serve God and advise people to do what you think God would want them to do, and to implement policies that you think would be better for people. And it's going to be, I feel like what Lee, I think you hit the nail on the head when you kind of said there's another parallel between libertarianism and Christianity, and this tensions that they have is that you could almost say that any action in the world to some extent doesn't adhere with the non-aggression principle, right? Because of just how much the state intervenes in so many different things. And that's the same with sort of the mixture of sin in these earthly kingdoms in the world. And it's you I don't know, you need some kind of framework that allows you to not call what is evil good, but to at least differentiate, rank order certain things in a certain way that doesn't if your model causes paralysis where you can't act, that's not a good model, would be my sense,
right,
if that makes sense.
And even I want to just push that too, though. It's not even just the state, but even oh, well, I don't know if I can buy products from this company because their marketing is deceptive, or you know what I mean?
Right.
There's no way you're going to find a company where there's nobody in their C-suite who ever does anything that's even a little bit dubious. That's just not going to happen. And so like I remember there years ago I had these like people that were very committed to anti-slavery, and they were like chastising and telling me like, well, you need to go look at what banks you use, and they were giving me a list of and it wasn't like the teller at my local branch was being whipped. It was like, oh, this bank funds this thing, and they're doing this over in some African thing where there's kids being used to get rare earths and blah blah. You know what I mean? Like, it was a 9 steps to Kevin Bacon kind of thing. And at some point, I was looking at it, but at some point, it's like I wouldn't be able to do anything. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, obviously, I'm not going to personally try to support slavery, and I'm going to speak out against it and stuff like that. But there's a sense in which you got to choose your battles, right? So, likewise here, yeah, I think one could argue that, yeah, the only principled thing to do is just to set yourself on fire or something. And even there, oh no, you might burn your neighbor's house down, so you can't do that. So anyway,
I wonder, and I know we're kind of like at time, but like I wonder if Christianity isn't a useful bulwark for this when properly understood, because like this tension doesn't just exist in these. I think it exists in a lot of things. Like I remember when I was still a lefty and I was a vegan, and like the vegan community would go into these like radical purity spirals too, where it's like, well, I mean, think about all the ways in which these different things at some point, were contributed to by some kind of animal cruelty or some kind of impact on the environment, which caused animal. So then, like, you just basically like, well, what can you do? It's like, well, you can just, go out in the woods and lay down and breathe and like just wait to die because.
Well, you probably squished a worm if you did that.
Oh,
you know what
right,
I mean? You probably
exactly.
ruined, some poor gopher had just built this tunnel and you just messed it up. So.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think, true Christianity to some extent helps us to. At least I think in the way that you like my synthesis of this, I think is similar to yours, where like we're trying to reconcile these things, and I think that keeping the gospel of Jesus Christ at the center, understanding that like we're gonna like when you realize you live in a fallen world and that we do have an eternal hope that is our North Star, but that like, hey, that doesn't mean we sit back and do nothing. Like we share that hope with people now, and we should do what we can to try to be a light into the world right now, make things better, because that is part of sharing the gospel with people. And yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but like that's okay. Like we do what we can to try to make things better, and we point towards the one who is perfect and the kingdom that is perfect. And I think that kind of helps keep us grounded, so to speak.
Yeah, I got a way to bring it to the gospel. Not that you didn't bring it to the gospel. Yeah, let me run this by you. I think it's something like, or one way of looking at it is, you're right. If you're really hung up on a works-based salvation, like, oh, I really got to make sure that I'm a good person, and I better have my, actions better be at least, above this threshold so that I'm a good person. You're going to be just walking around in constant anxiety and fear and uncertainty, and oh no, did I do? Oh geez, oh, there was this thing I didn't even know about that. Oh, is that my fault? Oh, but I could have known about that if I had done more research before I bought that product. I would have realized that they're using child labor, and I did. Oh geez, and then did I? And you're just going to be paralyzed, and you're going to end up being a worse person if you're walking around like that. Whereas if you say no, I deserve hell. Yeah, I am a bad person, both consciously and subconsciously, but my salvation comes from my faith in Jesus because He was perfect. Then all of a sudden that kind of takes that away from you. And then you, in practice, if you genuinely believe that, will be a better person, even according to your own value system, than under the other way. So it's this interesting thing where, it's kind of like the flaw with utilitarianism or something, that if you, well, you get the point, right? That if that's what you're trying to do, if you're setting out to be utilitarian, I think you would not promote as much utility among people as if you believed in natural rights or something. So anyway.
Yeah. Or to say what we had just said in Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 3:17. I had to look up, I knew the line, but not the actual citation. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So I think it's like the kind of we're holding it. It's like what frees us in all these different contexts is the Spirit of the Lord. And it not just gives us freedom from sin, it gives us freedom to act as ambassadors of God in this world, and to then hopefully try to implement these truths, implement these principles into life, because it all ties together, and it when we increase human flourishing, in people's lives, and we bring more liberty to them, it's circular, right? Like I think God's kingdom, God's model points to the importance of liberty, and liberty it points to the importance of God at the center of all of it. So I really like that. Bob, I'll give you, because I could keep going for 2 hours talking to you. I love talking with you, and we'll certainly, hopefully, do it again sometime. But any just closing thoughts you have, and then I just want, before we hop off, for you to plug where people can find you, and if you have anything exciting coming up you want to plug, take that opportunity too.
Sure. So I know we sort of pushed back against the critics on this, but I do the thing of Tom that, I did have him on a podcast before. For example, Jerome Powell has been shrinking the Fed's balance sheet. There was one little blip there, but since basically April of 2022, right? So if you're an Austrian libertarian and you've been saying money printer go burr this whole time, that's not what's been going on, right? So I agree that it's not enough just to know the principles, but you really should keep up to date with things and just, be aware of what's going on. Also, I'm not just saying this from afar, but like I've been working with various groups and stuff, and it's not that I have Donald Trump's ear, but I do talk to people who are like in his, maybe not inner circle, but the one after that. And it's really, there's a lot of potential here. And so I would caution against being a complete purist and saying, no, we don't want to get our hands dirty, that they're going to do something. And I think it's good for them to hear better ideas than dumber ideas. And if we think we have the best ideas, we shouldn't be quiet about that. And finally, ultimately, our salvation is not going to come from Donald Trump or Jerome Powell. It's coming from Jesus. And, that's really the ultimate truth. And I just encourage people not to get so hung up on the day-to-day affairs that we know we've got the ultimate salvation there.
Awesome. And Bob, what's the best way for people to find you? Social media, podcast?
Sure. On Twitter, I'm at Bob Murphy Econ. BobMurphyShow.com is my podcast. And again, my sort of day job is Infinio.ai if you want to go see the blockchain stuff we're building there. And I'm the host of the Human Action Podcast. So you can get that at Mises.org.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Bob, again for coming on. Thank you, everybody, for listening. First of all, definitely check out Bob's work and support him if you want, because he's been a tremendous resource for me and a lot of other of people in our movement. And so, I just want to remind you to do that. Definitely go follow him if you're not. In terms of what I got coming up, go to Biblical Anarchy on X. It's the best way to find a lot of the updates of what I got going on. Tomorrow, I have like 3 shows coming up. So if you guys want more content tomorrow, I'm going to be doing, I got the LCI Book Club tomorrow, and then I'm going to be on 2 different people's podcasts talking about different things. I'll put those links on my social media so you guys can see that. And then nothing until the new year then after that. So I'm finishing this year this week and then taking off for Christmas. So, but yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. Make sure you hit that thumbs up, like button, and subscribe before you go. And we'll talk to you next time. Live at peace and live for Christ. Take care.